Millionaire ignores little girl's request, but when he sees what she does, he bitterly regrets it. Richard dismissed his driver that morning. He wanted to walk a bit before diving into the hustle of his office in the financial district. That's when he spotted her, sitting on a worn wooden bench. A little girl of about 8 years old, curly hair tied in a messy ponytail, simple but clean school uniform. What caught his attention wasn't her presence, but the intensity with which she was drawing in a tattered notebook. "Sir, can you help me buy a present for my mother?" she said. Richard doesn't even look at her. He's seen this kind of scene before and continues on his way, ignoring the plea. However, in the days that follow, the little girl is still there, always sitting on the same bench, drawing without stopping. Something about the repetition of the scene bothers him. He decides to approach. "What are you drawing with such dedication?" "My mother's present. Since I can't buy anything, I'm doing the best I can for her." Moved, Richard takes one of the drawings. In it, he sees a large illuminated hotel, a smiling woman at the reception, and a little girl by her side. The detail that disconcerts him. He himself is in the scene. Something stirs inside him. For the first time in years, he feels a pang of genuine curiosity. There was something in those childish but precise strokes that transported him to a place far from his everyday reality. "What's your name?" he asked, returning the drawing. Beatrice Oliver," the girl answered without taking her eyes off her work. "And you're Richard Wallace. Everyone knows the owner of the beautiful hotels." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised to be recognized by a street child. He sat down on the bench, keeping a respectful distance. "And your mother, where is she?" "Working," B answered without hesitation. "She cleans houses in Riverdale, but today she's in Oakwood." "And shouldn't you be in school?" "I only have class in the afternoon. In the morning I wait here because we can't afford a babysitter." Richard checked his watch. He still had 20 minutes before the meeting. Something about the situation intrigued him, and he couldn't simply get up and leave. There was a dignity in the girl's posture, a determination that didn't match the apparent fragility of her situation. "Why did you draw a hotel?" he asked. B finally raised her eyes from the notebook. They were dark and deep with a disconcerting maturity. "Because my mum dreams of going back to work in one. She says it was the best job she ever had before everything changed." "Your mother worked in a hotel?" "In your hotel?" The answer came, with a sad smile. "The downtown Horizon. She was the best receptionist, everyone said so, until the day when—" The girl stopped suddenly, as if she had said too much. Richard felt a growing uneasiness inside him. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket, probably Helen, his secretary, reminding him of the meeting, but he ignored it. "Until the day when," he insisted. B slowly closed the notebook, putting it in her worn backpack. "I have to go to school now. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Wallace." She stood up with a formality that seemed rehearsed and began walking toward the subway station. Richard remained seated, watching her walk away. Something in the girl's story bothered him deeply, like a piece out of place in a puzzle he didn't even know he was putting together. He arrived late to the meeting that day, something unprecedented in his career. The shareholders noticed his distant gaze while discussing the expansion of the chain to the northeast. August Mendoza, his vice president and college friend, asked him if everything was all right, to which Richard responded with a vague nod. At night, in his empty and immaculate penthouse, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the little girl from the park and her mother, a former employee he didn't even remember. There was something disturbing about the fact that a child knew him when he had no idea who her mother was. The next morning, contrary to his meticulously planned routine, Richard passed through Memorial Park again. Beatrice was there, on the same bench, with the same notebook open. He approached, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate he had bought on the way. "Good morning, B. Would you like some chocolate?" The girl looked suspiciously at the cup, but accepted it with an almost inaudible, "Thank you." "Your mother's name is—" Richard tried, sitting down again beside her. Claire Oliver." Richard took out his phone and called Helen. "I need you to check something for me. a former employee of Downtown Horizon, Claire Oliver. I want to know when she worked with us and why she left. Minutes later, his phone vibrated with a message from his secretary. Claire Oliver, receptionist from 2016 to 2018. Dismissed for cause after incident with client. Do you want the complete report? Richard's face hardened. Dismissed for cause? What kind of incident would justify such a severe measure against an employee? What happened to your mother at the hotel, B? The girl stopped drawing, her eyes suddenly teary. She never tells me everything. She says she'll explain when I'm older, but I heard her crying many nights, talking on the phone with my aunt. I know an important man accused her of theft, but she never stole anything. My mum is the most honest person in the world. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't uncommon for employees to be accused of petty theft in luxury hotels, sometimes with reason, sometimes not. But usually these situations were resolved discreetly, without major trauma. And what happened after she left the hotel? We were homeless for a while, B said with frightening naturalness. We lived with my Aunt Rachel in Pinewood for a few months. Then Mum got work as a house cleaner, and we rented a small room in Eastside. Now we're better off. We have a small apartment in Southgate. Richard remained silent, processing the information. From receptionist at one of the best hotels in Boston to a house cleaner living in the outskirts. What exactly had happened to Claire Oliver? Want to see my drawing for today? Bea asked, breaking the silence. She turned the notebook. The drawing showed Claire in an elegant uniform behind the reception desk of the hotel. Her face radiated happiness and pride. Mom says it was the happiest time of her life working there. She studied English at night so she could serve foreigners. She was saving money to go to college for tourism. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. How many stories like that existed behind the anonymous faces who worked in his hotels? How many interrupted dreams? How many lives impacted by decisions that to him were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet? B, may I visit you and your mother one of these days? The girl looked at him with suspicion. Why? I want to better understand what happened. Maybe I can help. Mom doesn't like charity, B replied with surprising firmness for someone so young. She says, dignity can't be bought. Richard smiled, genuinely impressed with the girl's maturity. I'm not offering charity, B. I'm interested in your mother's story. If something unjust happened, I need to know. B hesitated for a moment, then tore a sheet from the notebook and wrote an address and a phone number. Sunday is the only day she doesn't work, the girl said, handing him the paper. But I don't promise anything. She won't like knowing we talked. Richard put the paper in his suit pocket and said goodbye to B. As he walked toward his office, he felt strangely light, as if he had made an important decision without even realizing it. Throughout the week, Richard couldn't get Claire and Beatrice Oliver out of his mind. He asked Helen to recover the entire history of the case, incident reports, testimonies, security footage, anything that could clarify the incident that had resulted in the dismissal for cause. On Friday, locked in his office, he watched the security footage dated October 17, 2018. The video showed Claire, a young and beautiful woman of approximately 30 years, being aggressively approached by a middle-aged man in the hotel lobby. The man gesticulated and pointed to something in his hand. It appeared to be a wallet. Claire maintained her professional posture, but her face showed anguish. Moments later, Robert Myers, then the hotel manager, appeared with 2 security guards. After a brief conversation, Claire was escorted out of the premises, visibly disturbed. The incident report explained the situation in cold bureaucratic language. Employee accused of wallet theft by VIP client, Mr. Alfonso Portinari, Italian businessman. Item later found in employee's possession. Dismissal for cause applied as per zero tolerance policy for offenses against clients. Richard felt anger growing inside him. Something in the story didn't make sense. He continued investigating and discovered, in an addendum to the report, that the wallet had been found in Claire's locker in the employee changing room, a location easily accessible to anyone. There were no fingerprints, no cameras in the changing room, or any concrete evidence beyond the client's word against the employees. More disturbing still was discovering that Alfonso Portinari was an important investor in the international expansion of the Horizon chain at that time. Losing his support could have cost millions, and manager Robert Myers had been promoted 3 months after the incident, assuming the regional directorship, a position he still held today. On Sunday, Richard drove his own car to the address B had given him. The contrast with his reality couldn't be greater, from Beacon Hill to Southgate, from the 4,000-square-foot penthouse to the simple building of affordable apartments. He parked his Porsche discreetly a few blocks away and walked to the building with no elevator. He climbed 4 flights of stairs and found apartment 42. He took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The sound of hurried steps was followed by Beatrice's childish voice. "Who is it?" "Richard Wallace." Silence. Then, the sound of a muffled argument. Finally, the door opened. Claire Oliver stood before him, older than in the security images, but still a beautiful woman. The same intense eyes as her daughter stared at him with a mixture of surprise and hostility. "What do you want?" Her voice was firm, showing no sign of intimidation in front of her former boss. "To talk," Richard replied simply, "about what happened in 2018. Claire crossed her arms, partially blocking the entrance. "After 5 years, you show up to talk? Why?" Richard noticed Beatrice partially hidden behind her mother, watching him expectantly. "Because your daughter made me see something I had never noticed before." Claire hesitated, looking at B with an expression that mixed confusion and concern. Finally, she opened the door wider. 15 minutes, we don't have more than that." The apartment was small but impeccably organized. Combined living room and kitchen, 2 tiny bedrooms, and a bathroom. On the walls, framed drawings by Beatrice, all showing scenes of prosperity. Nice houses, sunny landscapes, smiling people. "Your daughter has a lot of talent," Richard commented, observing the illustrations. "I didn't come from so far away to hear compliments about my daughter," Claire replied, indicating a simple chair for him to sit on. "What do you really want, Mr. Wallace?" Richard looked at her directly. "I want to know the truth about what happened that day when you were accused of theft." Claire's face hardened. "Why, to clear your conscience? Or is there some lawsuit I don't know about and you're trying to get ahead of it?" "None of that. I'm here because after reviewing the footage and reports, I realized something is wrong, and I need to know what really happened." Claire sat down, in front of him while Beatrice went to the bedroom, obeying a silent look from her mother. "I thought the great Richard Wallace didn't get involved with small operational problems." There was a touch of bitterness in her voice. "Isn't that what you said in general meetings? That you delegated so as not to get lost in details?" Richard felt the blow. That was exactly what he preached. Management by results, without emotional involvement in day-to-day operations. "It's true, and perhaps that was my biggest mistake," he admitted, surprising himself with the sincerity. "What really happened that day, Claire?" She took a deep breath, like someone who finally has the chance to tell a long-repressed story. "Alfonso Portinari, the Italian client. He had been staying in the presidential suite for 3 days. On the morning of the incident, he came to reception visibly agitated, accusing me of having stolen his wallet when I went to deliver a document to his room the night before." "And you had gone to his room?" "Yes, to deliver an urgent correspondence. Standard procedure," Claire explained. "What wasn't standard procedure was the way he received me, in a bathrobe, offering a glass of wine and suggesting that I enjoy the view of the suite. I politely refused and left as quickly as possible." Richard felt his stomach sink. "He made an advance and you refused?" "Exactly. The next morning he showed up with the stolen wallet story. When I denied it, he demanded to speak with management. Robert Myers arrived, heard his version, and without giving me a chance to defend myself, authorized the security guards to search my locker. Miraculously, the wallet was there, with all the money and documents intact." Claire gave a bitter laugh. "What kind of thief steals a wallet and keeps it in their own locker, without taking anything?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the scene. It was obvious now. Portinari had planted the wallet in Claire's locker as revenge for the rejection. "Why didn't you fight the dismissal? You could have sued the hotel, demanded the corridor camera footage." "With what money, Mr. Wallace?" Claire interrupted him. "I was a single mother earning just over minimum wage. Robert offered me two options: leave immediately with a neutral letter of recommendation or contest and face not only dismissal for a cause but also a possible criminal accusation. And you chose to leave." 4B, Claire confirmed, her voice finally trembling a little. "I couldn't risk it. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a stain on my resume that prevented me from getting another job in hospitality. I tried at every hotel in Boston, but the news had spread. Nobody hires a receptionist accused of theft." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of Beatrice moving something in the bedroom. "And Robert Myers?" Richard finally asked. "Do you think he knew the truth?" "I'm certain," Claire answered without hesitation. "He was negotiating with Portinari $1 million investment in the new Miami unit. The Italian was more important than any employee." Richard felt a wave of shame and anger. His hotel, his company, his name associated with such a flagrant injustice. And he, too busy with spreadsheets and strategic meetings, hadn't even become aware of the case. "Claire, he began, but was interrupted. "I don't need apologies, Mr. Wallace," she said, standing up. "I survived. I rebuilt my life. B has a decent school, food on the table. It's not the life I dreamed of, but it's dignified." "I want to fix this," Richard said, also standing up. "You can come back to the hotel with a promotion, or if you prefer, I can offer compensation for the moral and professional damage." Claire's look made him stop mid-sentence. "Do you really think that solves it? That money erases 5 years of struggle?" She walked to the door, opening it. "Your 15 minutes are up, Mr. Wallace." Richard took a business card and placed it on the table. "Think about it. Call me if you change your mind." As he left the apartment, Richard found Beatrice standing in the hallway holding a new drawing. She handed it to him without saying anything. In it, Richard saw what appeared to be an idealized version of what had just happened. He, Claire, and B smiling, holding hands, in front of what looked like the entrance to a hotel. "It's what I wanted to happen," the girl said with simplicity. "Mom going back to the job she loved." Richard carefully folded the drawing and put it in his pocket. "I'll do my best, B. I promise." On the way back home, Richard couldn't stop thinking. Claire's story was just the tip of the iceberg. How many other employees had been wronged in the name of profit and convenience? How many lives had been impacted by decisions made in air-conditioned meeting rooms by people who would never face the consequences? On Monday, he called an extraordinary meeting with the board. Robert Myers was present, comfortably installed in his regional director's chair, completely unaware of the hurricane that was about to hit him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, unusually serious, "we need to talk about something fundamental. Integrity." The directors exchanged confused looks. It wasn't common for Richard to start meetings with speeches about values. "I recently received information about a case that occurred in 2018, involving an employee of the downtown unit and a VIP client." Robert's face visibly paled. "Richard, if you're talking about the Portinari case, that was resolved according to company policies," he hurried to say. "The client was right, the employee—" "Shut up, Robert." Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I reviewed the footage. I investigated the case. I spoke personally with Claire Oliver. I know exactly what happened." A sepulchral silence took over the room. Richard continued. "We allowed a client to harass an employee, and when she rejected him, we accepted his version without question. We fired an exemplary professional based on a false accusation, and then we prevented her from working in her field, destroying her career." Robert tried to intervene again. "Richard, you don't understand. Portinari was negotiating an investment of 20 million euros, I know," Richard completed. "And you sacrificed an employee's dignity for it. You sold your integrity, Robert. And you sold mine too, because this happened under my management, in my company." The other directors observed the scene, astonished. They had never seen Richard so upset. "From today," he continued, "we are implementing changes. First, Robert Myers is terminated from the company, effective immediately." Robert stood up, red with anger. "You can't do this. I've worked here for 15 years. I tripled." the revenue of the Northeast region. And in return, I gave you the power to destroy lives, Richard retorted. Collect your belongings and leave. The legal department will contact you for the formal procedures. After Robert's tumultuous exit, Richard turned to the other directors. Second, we are creating the Dignity and Respect program, a direct channel for employees to report any type of harassment or injustice without fear of retaliation. Third, I want a complete review of all cases of dismissal for cause in the last 10 years. If we find more injustices, we will repair them. Helen, who was taking notes furiously, raised her hand. And what about Claire Oliver's specific case? Richard took a deep breath. I am offering her back her job with a promotion to customer relationship manager, if she accepts. If she doesn't accept, a substantial compensation and a public retraction from the company. Additionally, we will create a scholarship program for employees, starting with a full scholarship for Claire to complete her tourism education. The directors looked at each other, clearly concerned about the financial impact of the measures. August Mendoza, the vice president, was the first to speak up. Richard, I understand your indignation, but we need to think about the shareholders. This kind of program, the compensations, the possible negative repercussions, all of this can affect the value of the shares. August is right, agreed Fiona Robinson, the financial director. We're in the middle of negotiations for the expansion. In the Northeast, any instability could drive away investors. Richard looked at each of them, realizing for the first time the abyss between his renewed vision and the crystallized mentality of his team. Ladies and gentlemen, the real value of a company is not measured only by numbers on a balance sheet, he responded calmly. If we build our success at the expense of the dignity of our employees, what kind of success is that? The meeting ended with a mixed climate of confusion and apprehension. Richard knew he had initiated an internal revolution, but he had no idea of the size of the resistance he would face. That same afternoon, he called Claire. After explaining the changes he was implementing, he made the formal offer. I want you to come back, Claire, as customer relationship manager. Salary 3 times higher than before, full scholarship, and autonomy to implement policies of respect for employees. The silence on the other end of the line lingered for a few seconds. Why are you doing this, Mr. Wallace? Claire's voice sounded cautious. Is it remorse, guilt, or just an attempt to clean up your image? Maybe a bit of all that, Richard admitted honestly. But mainly because your daughter showed me something I had forgotten. That behind every business decision there are real people with dreams and dignity. I need to think, Claire replied. It's not a simple decision. I understand, take all the time you need. In the days that followed, Richard faced the first wave of resistance within the company. A group of shareholders, led by Richard's own father, Franklin Wallace, called for an extraordinary board meeting. The accusation, reckless management and decisions that could compromise the financial health of the company. Son, what's gotten into you? Franklin questioned, in a tone of frank disappointment. Firing Robert Myers, creating welfare programs, all because of some random cleaning lady. Receptionist, Dad, Richard corrected, feeling anger growing. A receptionist unjustly fired after being harassed. So what? Franklin retorted, to everyone's shock. That happens all the time in every company. It's the price of doing business in the real world. Do you think I built this empire by being nice? Richard stared at his father, seeing him in a new light. No, Dad. You built it by sacrificing people. And I continued your legacy without questioning. But now I am questioning. Franklin slammed his fist on the table. You will destroy everything we've built. The shareholders are in panic. The stocks have already fallen 3% since the news of Robert's termination leaked. Let them fall, Richard replied with surprising calm. I prefer a smaller and honest company than an empire built on injustices. The meeting ended with an ultimatum. Either Richard reconsidered his decisions or the board would vote on his continuance as president at the next assembly. For the first time in his career, Richard faced the real possibility of losing control of the company he had inherited. Claire finally responded to the proposal 3 days later. She agreed to return, but with one condition. In addition to the offered position, She wanted to personally implement the Dignity and Respect program, with autonomy to investigate and repair other cases similar to hers. "I don't just want my justice," she explained over the phone. "I want to ensure that no one else goes through what I went through." Richard accepted immediately. Something in Claire's determination deeply impressed him. This woman, who had faced so many difficulties because of an injustice from his company, wasn't seeking revenge or personal compensation. She wanted systemic change. The next day, sensational headlines appeared in the main economic news portals. Horizon Network: Air promotes internal revolution after scandal. Horizon Hotels shares plummet with announcement of social program. Robert Myers, former Horizon director, sues company for moral damages. The image crisis intensified when Robert, in an exclusive interview, accused Richard of ruining a solid company because of an outbreak of social conscience. Investors began to publicly question the CEO's mental sanity and his ability to lead the company. In the midst of the storm, Richard received an unexpected phone call. Alfonso Portinari, the Italian businessman involved in Claire's case, wanted an urgent meeting. Richard accepted, curious to hear the version of the man who had caused so much damage. Portinari appeared in Richard's office, accompanied by 2 lawyers. At 65, he was the image of the successful European businessman, perfectly trimmed grey hair, tailored Italian suit, impeccable posture. "Mr. Wallace, let's get straight to the point," he began with his heavy accent. "I heard you're reopening the case of that employee, Claire Oliver. This is a mistake." Richard remained impassive. Why would it be a mistake to correct an injustice? Portinari exchanged glances with his lawyers before continuing. "Because it would open a dangerous precedent. If every company decided to investigate all the small discrepancies of the past, the entire system would collapse." "Discrepancies?" Richard repeated, incredulous. "You planted a wallet in an innocent employee's locker because she rejected your advances. That's not a discrepancy, Mr. Portinari. It's harassment, followed by revenge." The Italian adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "Look, I didn't come here to discuss the past. I came to offer a solution. The Portinari Group is willing to increase its investment in the Horizon Network by 100 million euros on the condition that this case is discreetly archived." Richard felt a mixture of disgust and clarity. Is this how the business world worked? Money to cover up injustices, more money to silence victims? "I'm not interested in your money, Mr. Portinari. In fact, I'm terminating all contracts between the Horizon Network and your group, effective immediately." The Italian's face contorted into a mask of fury. "You will regret this, Wallace. I have powerful friends. I can destroy your reputation with a single call." Richard calmly stood up. "Do what you think is necessary, but know that if you try anything against me or against Claire Oliver, I have the hotel's security recordings, the complete ones, including those from the presidential suite corridor, which clearly show your behavior that night. I imagine your wife and your shareholders would love to see those images." It was a bluff. Richard wasn't sure if such recordings still existed, but the effect was immediate. Portinari paled, got up abruptly and left without saying anything more, followed by his disconcerted lawyers. The exit of the Portinari Group from Horizon Network Investments was announced the next day, causing a new drop in shares and intensifying pressure from shareholders. The extraordinary assembly to decide Richard's future as president was moved up to the following week. Meanwhile, Claire assumed her new position with impressive determination. In just a few days, she had completely reorganized the customer service department and begun mapping other cases similar to hers. Beatrice, now a regular visitor to the central office after school, transformed into a kind of informal mascot of the Dignity and Respect program, illustrating posters and brochures with her inspiring drawings. On the eve of the decisive assembly, Richard invited Claire and Beatrice to dinner at his penthouse. He wanted them to meet his mother, Elizabeth Wallace, who had returned hurriedly from a trip to Europe upon learning of the crisis. Elizabeth, an elegant 70-year-old lady, received the guests with a genuine cordiality that surprised Claire. "So you're the woman who finally made my son see beyond the numbers. she said, holding Claire's hands between hers. I was losing hope that this would ever happen. During dinner, served on the terrace with a view of the illuminated city, Elizabeth shared stories that Richard had never heard, about how she herself had worked as a maid in hotels before meeting Franklin, about the difficulties she had faced as a woman in an environment dominated by men, about how she had always tried to influence her husband, and later her son, to see the human side of business. Franklin was a visionary, but a man of his time, she explained, while Beatrice silently drew in a corner. He believed that business and feelings didn't mix. Richard grew up hearing that. Claire observed the interaction between mother and son with interest. And what do you believe, ma'am? Elizabeth smiled, a tired but determined smile. I believe that a company is like a living organism. Each person who works in it is an essential cell. When one cell suffers, the entire organism is affected, even if it doesn't immediately perceive it. Richard looked at his mother with a new admiration. Why did you never tell me this before? I did, son, many times, but you weren't ready to hear it. Elizabeth turned to Beatrice, who was approaching with a new drawing. What do we have here, dear? The drawing showed all of them, Richard, Claire, Beatrice, and Elizabeth, holding hands in front of what appeared to be the renovated facade of the downtown Horizon Hotel, with a large sign that read, Dignity and Respect Program. It's the future, Beatrice explained with simplicity. What will happen after Uncle Richard wins the meeting tomorrow? The adults exchanged emotional glances. The child's unwavering confidence contrasted with the difficult reality they faced. The latest internal polls indicated that Richard would likely lose the board vote by a narrow margin. And if I don't win, B? Richard asked softly. What if they have to find another president for the company? Beatrice tilted her head, considering the question seriously. Then you build another hotel, a better one, where nobody is treated badly. The answer, in its childish simplicity, hit Richard like a revelation. Yes, there were other possibilities beyond fighting for the family company. Perhaps it was time to create something completely new. The next morning, Richard arrived early, at the company auditorium where the assembly would take place. Claire was already there, organizing a presentation of the first results of the Dignity and Respect program, a preliminary report that identified at least 12 other cases of employees unfairly dismissed or harmed in the last 5 years. Are you ready? She asked, noticing Richard's serene expression. Like never before, he replied, surprising her with a calm smile. Regardless of the outcome, we did the right thing. The shareholders began to arrive, followed by journalists and company executives. Franklin Wallace entered last, accompanied by August Mendoza and other allies. They sat in the front row directly in front of the podium, where Richard would make his defense. The assembly began with the formal reading of the agenda, evaluation of Richard Wallace's continuity as president of the Horizon Hotel Network due to recent decisions that potentially compromise the financial health and reputation of the company. Richard was called to present his defense. As he climbed to the podium, he noticed Elizabeth, Claire, and Beatrice sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium. Beatrice gave a thumbs up in a gesture of encouragement that made him smile. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice clear and firm echoing through the silent auditorium. We are here to decide not only the future of a president, but the future of a company. The real question we must ask ourselves is, what kind of company do we want to be? A murmur ran through the room. Richard continued. For years I guided myself exclusively by numbers. Profit, expansion, return for shareholders. And we were successful, no doubt. The Horizon Network is today one of the largest in the country, with international projection. He paused, looking directly at his father. But at what cost? In recent days I discovered that our company has a dark history of injustices and abuses systematically covered up in the name of profit. Dedicated employees unfairly dismissed, harassment allegations ignored, people treated as disposable parts. The fee buzz increased. Franklin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Some will say this is normal, that it's the price of doing business. I say it's unacceptable, and more, it's a terrible business model in the long run. Richard signaled to Claire, who stood up and walked to the podium with her report. "This is Claire Oliver, unfairly dismissed 5 years ago and now our new customer relationship manager and coordinator of the Dignity and Respect program. She will present some data that I consider crucial for our discussion." Claire took the microphone with surprising confidence for someone who, until weeks ago, was cleaning houses to survive. "Good morning. In the last 2 weeks, we conducted a preliminary survey of cases similar to mine. We found evidence of 12 potentially unjust dismissals in the last 5 years. But the most impressive thing is not these numbers, but the financial impact they caused." She activated the projector, showing a graph. This graph shows the cost of replacing employees. Each time we unfairly dismiss an experienced professional, we spend on average 4.5 times their annual salary to find, train, and establish a replacement, at the same level of productivity. Considering only the 12 identified cases, we're talking about a direct loss of almost $7 million. The shareholders exchanged surprised looks. Claire continued, "But the impact goes beyond that. Customer satisfaction analyses show a direct correlation between employee turnover and perceived service quality. Units with greater team stability have customer return rates up to 27% higher." She advanced to the next slide. And there's more. Recent research shows that companies with solid dignity and respect policies have market values on average 18% higher than competitors of similar size without such policies. They are preferred by institutional investors concerned with governance and sustainability, a growing trend in the global market. Richard took back the microphone, thanking Claire with a respectful nod. "As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we're not just talking about doing what's right for moral reasons. We're talking about building a truly sustainable company that generates long-term value." He looked at his father again, now firmly. "I was raised to believe that business and human values are incompatible. Now I see that, in fact, they are inseparable. A company that destroys lives ends up destroying itself, sooner or later." Franklin Wallace stood up abruptly. "This is nonsense," he interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "You're fantasizing about the business world, Richard. It has always been this way and always will be. The strongest survive, the weak are left behind." "That's the kind of thinking that's being left behind, Dad," Richard replied calmly. "The world is changing. Consumers are more aware, employees more demanding, investors more attentive to ethical issues." Franklin shook his head, incredulous. "I will propose the vote right now. Who agrees with the immediate removal of Richard Wallace from the presidency of the Horizon Network?" Several hands were raised, but not as many as Richard expected. His mother, who had significant shares in the company, remained firmly with. Her arms crossed, as did some young shareholders who seemed impressed with the presentation. "Who opposes Richard's removal?" Franklin asked, visibly nervous to see that the vote would be more disputed than he imagined. More hands were raised. The preliminary count showed a technical tie. Franklin looked around, searching for missing votes. That's when the doors of the auditorium opened, and an unexpected figure entered. Robert Myers, the former director fired by Richard days before. All eyes turned to him as he slowly walked to the center of the hall. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice laden with emotion. "I came here to confess that Richard is right. Claire Oliver's case was not the only one. For years, under direct guidance from Franklin Wallace, I covered up dozens of similar irregularities." A shocked murmur ran through the audience. Franklin advanced threateningly toward Robert. "Shut up, you traitor! You signed confidentiality. Agreements. Agreements that protected me while I protected you," Robert replied without backing down. "But I can't live with this anymore. The last few nights have been hell for me, reliving every injustice I helped perpetuate. I fired innocent people, intimidated whistleblowers, manipulated reports." He took a folder from his pocket and handed it to the Assembly Secretary. "Here is evidence of 23 cases in the last 10 years. Names, dates, circumstances, including cases in which Mr. Franklin Wallace directly ordered the dismissal of employees who refused to participate in accounting or tax fraud." The auditorium exploded in exclamations of surprise and indignation. Franklin, pale, let himself fall into his chair. Richard, as surprised as everyone, watched the scene in disbelief. "Why are you doing this, Robert?" he asked when the tumult diminished a bit. Robert looked at Claire, then at Richard. "Because you gave me something I haven't had in years, the chance to look in the mirror without shame. Your firing me was the best thing that happened to me, Richard. It was the wake-up call I needed." The Assembly Secretary, after quickly checking the contents of the folder, called for attention. "In view of this new information, I suggest we postpone the vote until an independent audit can verify these allegations." Franklin, recovering some of his composure, stood up. "All of this is a farce, a conspiracy orchestrated by Richard to remain in power. I demand that the vote continue." But the shareholders no longer seemed so convinced. One of them, representing an international investment fund, spoke up. "As a responsible investor, I cannot vote without adequately analyzing this new information. I support postponing the vote and the immediate hiring of an independent audit." Others quickly agreed. The tide had turned. A new vote was proposed to postpone the decision about the presidency until the completion of the audit, with Richard remaining in the position temporarily. The proposal was approved by a large majority. At the end of the assembly, as the groups dispersed in agitated conversations, Richard found himself alone with his father in a corner of the auditorium. "Is it true?" he asked simply. "Everything Robert said?" Franklin looked at his son with an expression difficult to decipher, a mixture of anger, shame, and perhaps very subtly a touch of relief. "For you don't understand, you never will. I did what was necessary to build an empire, to give you everything I never had. At the expense of innocent people. At the expense of whatever was necessary," Franklin exploded, only to immediately lower his voice. "The world isn't fair, Richard. It never was. Either you're the wolf or you're the lamb." Richard shook his head, feeling a deep sadness. "There are other paths, Dad, and I'm going to prove it." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced around his penthouse, reflecting on the day's events, on Robert's shocking revelation, on his father's apparent moral collapse. Everything he had believed in was being questioned. At 3 in the morning, he received a message from Claire. "You accomplished something extraordinary today. Not because of what happened at the assembly, but because you initiated real change. Thank you for believing." Attached to the message was a new drawing from Beatrice. In it, Richard appeared in the center of a circle formed by several people, all holding hands. The caption, written in the girl's irregular handwriting, said, "A company is not a building. It's a circle of people who care." That simple image contained the truth Richard was seeking. His father was wrong. We weren't forced to choose between being the wolf or the lamb. We could choose to be human, simply human, with all the complexity and beauty that implied. In the months that followed, the independent audit confirmed most of Robert's allegations. Franklin Wallace was officially removed from the board, and Richard was confirmed as president by a large majority. But the victory came with a personal price. His father refused to speak to him, considering him a traitor to the family and the values that had built the company. The Dignity and Respect program, under Claire's leadership, expanded to all units of the network. The identified cases of injustice were reviewed one by one, with offers of rehiring or compensation for those who had been wronged. A new zero tolerance policy against harassment was implemented, with anonymous reporting channels and rigorous investigations. Beatrice, meanwhile, received a scholarship to the best art school in Boston, where her talent for drawing flourished every day. Her works continued to decorate the central office of the Horizon Network, inspiring employees and visitors. 1 year after the beginning of the transformation, Richard decided to rename the downtown unit, where everything had begun with the injustice against Claire, as Horizon Dignity Hotel. The reopening ceremony included all employees rehired. After the case reviews, as well as authorities and media representatives. During his speech, Richard looked at the audience and saw an unexpected face, his father, discreetly positioned at the back of the hall. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Richard noticed something different in his father's expression. It wasn't approval, not yet, but perhaps a beginning of understanding. At the end of the ceremony, when all the formalities were over and the guests began to disperse, Richard felt someone gently pull on his sleeve. It was Beatrice, now wearing an elegant school uniform, very different from the worn clothes of a year before. "I have a present for you," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a drawing different from all the previous ones. It showed Richard and Franklin Wallace holding hands in front of the New Horizon Dignity Hotel. The caption simply said, "What will happen yet?" "How do you know?" Richard began to ask, looking in the direction where he had seen his father moments before, but he had already left. "I don't know." Beatrice smiled with that mysterious wisdom that children sometimes possess. "But I draw what I feel needs to happen, and this needs to happen, doesn't it?" Richard nodded slowly, carefully, keeping the drawing. Perhaps reconciliation with his father was still possible. Perhaps the circle could be completed. That night, during the party that celebrated not only the reopening of the hotel, but the complete transformation of a corporate culture, "Richard," observed Claire, confidently interacting among executives and authorities. That extraordinary woman who had faced so much adversity now led a silent revolution in the American corporate world. Elizabeth approached her son, following his gaze. "She's special," she commented with a knowing smile. "Yes, she is." "Richard," agreed. "Claire has a strength I've never seen before, an integrity that doesn't bend. And you have feelings for her." It wasn't a question. Richard was surprised by his mother's observation, but didn't deny it. "We're still getting to know each other. There's a complex history between us, many imbalances to resolve. I don't want to rush anything." Elizabeth nodded, approving the sensible response. "Time will tell, but I've never seen you look at someone like that before." The party continued into the night, celebrating not only the success of a company, but the birth of a new vision of business, one in which dignity and respect were not empty slogans, but fundamental principles of operation. Months later, Richard received an unexpected invitation. His father wanted to meet him for a private lunch. The chosen location, a simple restaurant in the city center, far from the sophisticated environments that Franklin normally frequented, already indicated that something had changed. When he arrived, Richard found his father already seated, looking older and more tired than he remembered. "Thank you for coming," Franklin said, without preamble. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd refused." Richard sat down, noticing that his father had ordered water, not the whiskey he used to drink even during business lunches. "What happened, Dad? You seem different," Franklin completed with a sad smile. "Let's say I had a revealing experience, a health scare that made me reevaluate some things." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Are you okay?" "I'll survive." Franklin made a dismissive gesture, but being face to face with your own mortality makes a man think about what he built, about what he'll leave behind. He took a sip of water before continuing. "I spent my life believing that success was measured by the size of the empire you build, by the fear or respect your name inspires, by the power you exert over others." Richard listened in silence, realizing that his father needed to unburden himself. "But then I saw what you did with the company, how you transformed it, and the results." Franklin shook his head, still incredulous. "The shares went up. The demand for franchises increased. You're receiving awards for sustainability, for governance. Dignity and respect are good business, Dad," Richard said softly. "They always have been." Franklin nodded slowly. "Yes, your mother tried to tell me that for decades, but I was too busy being a businessman to listen to a woman's wisdom." The lunch proceeded with a surprisingly frank conversation. Franklin spoke about regrets, about the sleepless nights remembering questionable decisions, about the fear that his legacy would be a company built on exploitation and fear. "I'm not asking to return to the board," he clarified at the end of the meal. "My time has passed, but I would like to learn more about this program that you and Claire created. Maybe I can help somehow. I have experience. I know people." Richard smiled, moved by his father's unprecedented vulnerability. "It would be a pleasure, Dad. Claire will love to hear your stories, and there's so much work to do." They left the restaurant side by side, not completely reconciled, but Walking in the same direction for the first time in many years. That same afternoon, Richard went to the art school where Beatrice studied. He waited patiently on the sidewalk until the end of classes, feeling a strange combination of anxiety and expectation. When the girl came out, carrying a portfolio full of new drawings, her face lit up when she saw Richard. "You came!" she exclaimed, running to hug him. "How was lunch with your dad?" Richard's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Oh, the drawing." Beatrice nodded, with that enigmatic smile that seemed to hold secrets of the universe. "Can I see your new works?" he asked as they walked toward the car. The girl opened the portfolio, proudly showing her most recent creations. One in particular caught Richard's attention. It showed him and Claire holding hands in a garden while Beatrice played with a dog. "We don't have a dog yet," the girl observed, as if commenting on something absolutely normal. "But Mom said that when we move to the new house, maybe we can adopt one." Richard frowned, confused. "New house?" "The one you're going to buy in Brookline," Beatrice answered naturally. "The one with the pool and the big garden." Richard couldn't help but laugh. That child's imagination was truly extraordinary. Or was it something more? "Bea, do you think you and your mum and me—" The girl carefully put away the drawings before answering. "Mum likes you, for real. Not the way she likes Uncle August, which is just friendship, in a different way." Richard felt his heart race. Claire and he had grown much closer over the past year, working together, sharing ideals, building something meaningful. But both maintained a respectful distance, perhaps fearful of complicating such a successful, professional partnership. "And what do you think about that?" he asked as he opened the car door for Beatrice to get in. "I think we need a dog," the girl answered with implacable logic. "And that you make my mom smile. She almost never smiled before." That night, during an informal dinner at the new headquarters of the Dignity and Respect Foundation, a non-profit organization created to expand the work beyond the hotel chain, Richard finally found the courage to invite Claire to dinner, just the two of them. "Like a date?" she asked directly, those intense eyes fixed on his. "Yes," Richard replied with the honesty he was still learning to practice. "Like a date." Claire smiled, a smile that illuminated her whole face. "It's about time. Beatrice has been making drawings about this for months." Both laughed, complicit in the mystery that was that extraordinary child who had somehow transformed their lives. 6 months later, the Oliver Wallace family moved into a house in Brookline. Not exactly like in Beatrice's drawing, the pool was smaller, the garden not so big, but with more than enough space to accommodate Thor, a rescued Labrador from a shelter who immediately became the girl's best friend. The Horizon Hotel Network, renamed as the Horizon Hospitality and Dignity Network, was now expanding with a completely renewed business model. Each new unit integrated advanced policies of respect for employees and social responsibility. The Dignity and Respect program became a national reference, studied in business schools, and replicated by other companies. Franklin Wallace, recovered from his health scare, now dedicated himself to lecturing young entrepreneurs about ethics in business, sharing his own mistakes as examples of what not to do. Although he still had difficulty expressing emotions, he had developed a surprisingly affectionate relationship with Beatrice, who fondly called him Grumpy Grandpa. Claire officially assumed the People and Culture Directorship of the network, completed her tourism education, and was now starting a master's degree in sustainable management. Her story of overcoming inspired thousands of people, especially women in vulnerable situations, and Beatrice continued drawing. Her works, increasingly sophisticated, had already been exhibited in small galleries and, according to her teachers, demonstrated exceptional talent. But beyond her artistic gift, it was her ability to see possibilities where others saw only difficulties that really made her extraordinary. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, while the family relaxed in the garden, Claire reading a book, Richard reviewing projects for the new unit in Seattle, Thor napping in the shade, Beatrice approached. With her notebook. "I have a new drawing," she announced, with the seriousness she maintained when presenting her creations. Richard and Claire came closer to see. The drawing showed a woman who looked very much like Claire, but older, standing in front of an imposing building that didn't look like any of the chain's hotels. Below, the caption, "Future President of the United States." Claire covered her mouth with her hands between shocked and amused. "B, that's crazy, I never—" "Not yet," the girl calmly corrected. "But one day, after you transform all the companies, it will be time to transform the country." Richard smiled, hugging the two women who had completely changed his life. "You know what? I don't doubt it one bit. If there's one thing I've learned in recent years, it's that we shouldn't underestimate the power of a determined woman to create a better world. Much less two." Claire kissed him softly, while Beatrice smiled, satisfied. The circle that had begun with a casual encounter in a park continued to expand, transforming not only a company or a family, but creating waves of change that would reach much further than any of them could imagine. Thor barked happily as if approving the plan, and in that sunny garden surrounded by love and purpose, Richard finally understood what true success meant. The end of the story, dear listener. We hope the story of Richard, Claire, and Beatrice has touched your heart. If you've made it this far, please leave that like on the video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories like this one. Now tell us, do you believe Beatrice's drawings were just imagination, or could she really predict the future? Leave your opinion in the comments, and would you change something in your company to create a more dignified and respectful environment?